The candidates for U.S. House Pennsylvania District 6 had a debate. Now, before I get into the debate or even the candidates, I think I should give some context on the makeup of this district. District 6 comprises most of Chester County, Pennsylvania, and a little bit of Berks County. This is a heavily gerrymandered district, gerrymandered to be pretty significant blue. Chester is, of course, a Philadelphia suburb. It's traditionally known as a little more affluent, so like the upper middle class people who work in the city come home to Chester County each day. The parts of Berks County that are included here, meanwhile, are a little more rural, except for, notably, the city of Reading. High population, high proportion Hispanic. So the district has these affluent urban people, and then it has these not affluent urban people, and then it has a bunch of rural red people in between who can just, I guess, deal with the fact that they're not really represented in the House. For the past few elections, this district has gotten between 300,000 and 400,000 votes. In 2018, the Democrat won that election with a gap of 53,000 votes. That's a gap of 17 points. The score was 58 to 41. In 2020, it was 56 to 43. The gap was 49,000 votes, and in 2022, another 17-point gap, 58 to 41 again, and 54,000 votes. And all three times that same Democrat, Young-Houlahan, was the one that won that election. She's been sitting in this seat for about 6 years now. Now, during her time in office, she's been a member of various committees, most notably including the Armed Services Committee. I say most notably because she, as I understand it, she had no small part in crafting the draft reform bill that would basically automate selective service registration. To be fair to her, though, as I understand it, all that bill would do was take the manual process that each male at the age of 18 was required to do, and make it so it happens behind the scene automatically. You don't get a paper in the mail that you have to figure out how to fill out. However, having her face so visibly tied to legislation relating to the draft, that has made her no friends in certain groups of voters. Pennsylvania has a lot of Quakers, Amish, Mennonites, people who have a religious obligation to avoid violence. Those people know a little bit more about the draft than average because they can look back on stories from their own families, their own communities during the Vietnam War, and they can see that yes, there are draft alternatives. Many of the people from those groups served in hospitals stateside or did other sorts of alternative work. I think the official term is 1W, don't quote me on that. That's the code for the type of work assignment as an alternative for the draft that someone could do as part of selective service if they're called up. So people from those religious groups will be familiar with that. Another group, this is the least significant of the three groups I will mention. This group is the anti-Israel right wing. They do exist. They do have a hefty online presence, but they're spread out all across the country. I don't think any particular district has a notably potent concentration of them to really swing a U.S. House election. The third group I will mention, though, are pro-Palestine left-wing people. In 2023 and 2024, of course, with what's been happening in Gaza and Israel, this group of people has had reason to have their grievances with the Democrat Party, especially with a Democrat who has been part of the Armed Services Committee, has worked on draft legislation, has been visibly pro-Israel, as Young-Houlahan has been. Now, granted, I will give this group an optimistic appraisal of swinging 4 figures of votes in this particular House election. I think their ultimate impact will be in the low 4-figure range. The city of Reading does have an Islamic cultural center. I've seen that people have been putting pro-Palestine flyers on the street lamps, the street posts of Reading. I've also seen a handful of Muslims for Trump signs at the rally. That's, of course, the rally that I attended when Trump came to Reading. And as I understand it, this group of people is not just in Reading, but they're also dispersed all around Chester County as well. So as best I can estimate, I would say low 4 figures is the number that they swing. Now, as for this debate and how it went, admittedly, it could have gone a lot better for Neil Young. I also think it could have gone at least a little bit better for Young-Houlahan. I think Young made a mistake going into this. He accepted Young-Houlahan's demand that the debate be hosted by none other than the NAACP and the questions be submitted by none other than the League of Women Voters. If you don't know the political standing of those two groups, you can probably guess it just from the name. I'll get into it more at the end, but overall I found the questions that they threw at both of these candidates really to be a little bit oddball, a little bit off the wall, to the point where even Young-Houlahan looked confused at some of the questions. I don't think that was on either of the candidates, even though it came off as looking like the candidates being unprepared. I think it was just the moderator and the debate coordinators and the groups submitting the questions not being in touch with regular voters, not being in touch with this local area. I'm going to chalk that up to this group being a little bit of a wingnut group, even by Democrat standards, or rather neoliberal standards. That's what Young-Houlahan is. But that being said, yes, it did come off as looking like the candidates were unprepared. I think Neil Young would have been better served by giving a stream of media appearances to various local news networks, not in debate form, but just him speaking to an interviewer from any number of local cable news channels or local newspapers. That would have had the added benefit of making Young-Houlahan look like she's hiding from the press and forcing her to get herself out there more. Yes, she could have accused him of being a coward avoiding a debate. However, I will point out one more thing. This debate was hosted by BCTV, Berks County Television. That's the local news station that aired it. It is a cable news station, so right there, right away, that vastly limits the number of Spanish-speaking people who are going to tune into this, and it vastly limits the number of people under the age of 65 who are going to turn into this. Now, the debate was also uploaded to YouTube on the BCTV YouTube channel. I will link that below. At my time of viewing, this is around 2-3 days after the debate, it had 680 some views, and 4 of those views were me. So right there, that tells you the amount of voters that this debate is likely to swing. That's probably going to be in the single digits. At least people who viewed on YouTube. I'll be a little more generous. People who viewed it on cable TV, it might swing 3 digits of voters. So I don't think the debate itself is going to have a large effect. But for the people who did watch it, the people who are swayed by it, well, let's get into it. Houlahan's opening statement. Amusingly, one of the first things the moderator does is mispronounce Houlahan's name, calling her Miss Hooligan. But anyway, the opening statement felt a little bit scripted, as politician statements do. She is a veteran of the Air Force, she swore an oath to serve the country, she's been doing so faithfully both in the military and in Congress, yada yada. We know how it goes. Neil Young's opening statement, he gives a 15-second spiel in Spanish, talking about schools and the importance of raising our children. Now, Neil Young's background, he is a teacher from Chester County. He teaches, if I recall correctly, history. A few quotes from his opening statement, quote, "Our public schools have traded excellence for equity," unquote. He briefly mentions in a few places the dangers of woke ideology in public schools. And, quote, "If someone promises something tomorrow that they could have done yesterday, they may not be willing to make good on that promise," end quote. Talking about how the Democrats have abandoned the common people. Now, Neil Young, of course, having a background in education, his big issue that he talks about most often is school choice. But also the thing I care a lot about, he is completely willing to back Donald Trump's energy policy. I think that is important to bring down inflation. I think we are at a national crisis emergency level with inflation. I think number one thing that the new Republican administration needs to do when they get in there is take drastic steps to reduce the cost of living for everyone in the country. But enough with that tangent. Question number 1, what are the 3 most important issues for Congress to focus on? Neil got to answer that one first. He gave a long-winded answer, but the gist of it was, number 1, wars, number 2, inflation, number 3, immigration, and he also snuck in there something about energy. Houlahan's answer, though, number 1 is wars, number 2 is the economy. That's different from what Neil Young said about inflation. Houlahan implied that COVID was responsible for a lot of the economic woes, and she does say later on in the debate that she believes, yes, she really believes this, the Democrat administration has been doing good work on the economy, and the economy is gradually getting better. She genuinely tried to tell voters that. And yes, I suppose in the short term, gas prices have been falling. That's because it's an election year. Also in the short term, interest rates have been going down. Again, I very much suspect that's because it's an election year. I think as soon as Democrats get back into office, if Democrats do, I don't think they will, but as soon as that happens, we're going to go right back to the status quo, more inflation, and then 4 years down the road, gas prices are going to be double what they are now, and we're going to think that's normal. But anyway, number 3 most important issue for Congress, according to Young-Houlahan, is the U.S. and the world standing of America. She talked about the importance of emphasizing American technology and jobs, which is interesting to hear a Democrat say that. I would actually be genuinely interested to hear her expand on that. If she does get elected, I think I will at some point invite her on the show just to do an interview and talk about news and stuff, and this could be one of the things I ask her about. Now, here's where we get to see the full effect of this being hosted by the NAACP and the questions being submitted by the League of Women Voters. Question number 2. What steps would you take at the federal level to address systemic racism? Houlahan gets to answer that first. She says that different schools have different levels of funding, different amounts of resources that they can devote to providing to those kids. Talks about numbers for various schools in Chester County for the amount of funding they have per student. Talks about how healthy or unhealthy the school lunches are in those places. Neil Young, in his answer, he emphasizes the point that school choice makes up for failing schools. And I do note for this question, this is a question I would have flubbed. Neil, with his strong point being school choice, he was very prepared for this. He was on point. Now, question number 3, this is the one that really cemented in my mind how bad the NAACP and the League of Women Voters are at choosing questions. This question was about the importance of church and state, and also what would you do to address the concerns of voters from minority religions. Houlahan answered first on the previous question, so Neil Young had to answer this question first. And you could see on his face, he was just like, what? As anyone would be, honestly, but unfortunately, I think it came off as the candidate being unprepared rather than this being just a really weird question. And he reacted the way that I think a lot of people would react. It came off sounding like word salad, but it's just like, yeah, separation of church and state is important. What of it? Yeah, minority religious voters, I hope they all vote. What does this have to do with policy? He didn't directly say, what does this have to do with policy, but that was what I was thinking. I'm sure that's what he was thinking as well. Houlahan, being from a little bit more left-wing side of the spectrum, she was a little bit more prepared for this question, and also she had the time to listen to Neil's answer to think of her own response. The government needs to distance itself from the church. And then she took this opportunity to jab back on the school choice argument. I don't want taxes going to faith-based schools. If parents have school choice, they can choose to send their kids to faith-based schools. I don't want taxpayer money going to that. And she argued that we should be building up public schools instead. What's next on this list of debate questions but a question about Roe versus Wade? Houlahan gets the first response on this one, and she gives an emotional, heartrending story about her newly born granddaughter coming into a world where she has less rights than I have. Neil Young gives a more sensible answer, a more policy-focused answer, rather. He says it's a state decision. He cites numerous legal scholars, including Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who said that the original Supreme Court decision had shaky legal ground. Okay, you may support abortion, but it's not really correct to say that this is a constitutional right. And yes, I do believe in liberty. I think the law should reflect values of liberty. I think when in doubt, something should usually almost always be allowed by law. That's just what I think. But Neil Young's answer focused on the legal scholarship of that and why it's good that the individual states now have that decision. Which, as much as I agree with it, I think unfortunately the number of voters who are open to that kind of facts-based, legally grounded argument, I think that number is not as big as it was in the 2010s or the 90s. That's just the impression I get. I think we have a lot more knee-jerk reaction, emotion-based voters now. I think Houlahan's answer fed straight into her base. I think Neil Young's answer fed straight into his base. I think an undecided voter watching this is not going to be overly drawn either to or away from one side or the other. Now, as I'm sure you've noticed, the first candidate to be called on to answer any given question is at a disadvantage here, because there's an inevitable deer-in-the-headlights moment as we process just how blank-minded some of these questions are. This next question is better than most. They ask about whether or not the current border funding is sufficient. Neil Young says the border funding is not sufficient. Remain in Mexico was a good policy. They need to criminalize visa overstays, build the wall, and explore both high-tech and low-tech solutions to illegal immigration. Illegal border crossing specifically. Houlahan, meanwhile, circles back to abortion and pretends it's unclear what he said. I think he's pretty clear that he feels morally abortion is wrong, so that makes him pro-life. However, he does not support a national abortion ban. I think that was pretty understandable. But I also think Houlahan is making it part of her campaign strategy to try and make it appear as if he's flip-flopping on that, but it feels pretty astroturfed, at least to me, but I'm already a Neil Young supporter. Houlahan goes on, though, to say that holding children in custody at the border is wrong. And do you remember back to both the first and the second Dave McCormick McBob-Casey debate, the magic, sacred, bipartisan border bill endorsed by the Border Patrol once again makes a comeback. Young-Houlahan is very sad that not enough MAGA Republicans support that bill. And at this point, this wasn't really explained at the beginning, but I was able to infer that each candidate has a card that they're able to trade in at any moment in exchange for a 1-minute rebuttal. Neil Young uses his card at this moment to clap back a little on that magic, sacred, bipartisan border bill endorsed by the Border Patrol. Quotes the author of the bill saying that the author says the bill was unrecognizable by the time it got back to him after the committees had added their amendments onto it. And here's a nice little quote. "Sometimes bipartisan only serves two parties and it doesn't serve the American people," end quote. Young has a lot of quotable moments here. Young-Houlahan at this point also uses her rebuttal card, this time drawing from her experience actually working in Congress. Says that it's normal for a bill to be unrecognizable after all the amendments are tacked on. Says that she's had meetings with the author of that bill. And at this point, I don't think either candidate had any more rebuttals left in their quiver. So the questions continue. The next question is about human trafficking on the border. Young-Houlahan is first to answer. Says that she has a wealth of experience from various congressional task forces. And she says something interesting. She says in her experience that a lot of human trafficking, drug trafficking, weapons trafficking actually comes from the U.S. down into Mexico, but that we also have problems on the northern border as well. But she says a disproportionate amount comes from America to Mexico. I would like to see the source of that information. Neil Young answers, though, and quotes the number 300,000 missing children that have come across the border. We don't know where they are, and I find it honestly pretty sad to think about where they might be. I think both candidates sounded pretty strong on that particular question. Next up, affordable housing. Neil Young comes first. People in the millennial and Gen Z generation have been priced out of the housing market due to rising house prices. He says that restrictions on fossil fuels have been causing a rise in the price of construction. He says that government subsidies for home buyers just drive up the price of housing even more. He says we need to make it easier and cheaper for builders and renovators to do what they do. Also, the border isn't helping. Young-Houlahan says that the SALT tax is not helpful, says that local zoning laws are not helpful for house prices, says that equity matters, and she seizes on that last comment that Neil Young said about the migrants, and says that the people coming across the border because they can't afford the high-budget homes, it's not affecting the housing market, even though we have millions of new people in the country driving up housing demand, whether that be housing, renting, what have you. Neil Young responds that rental prices and home prices traditionally are always tacked along with each other. The next question, this was a fun one. The candidates are asked about foreign relations. Nothing specific, they're just asked to talk about foreign relations. And treating the candidates like children. Direct quote, I could not make this up. You may want to address cooperative agreements, foreign aid, countries at war. It's the candidate's job to think of an answer. Never mind that, it's your job to ask a specific question, more specific than just talk about foreign relations. And then even Chrissy Young-Houlahan, she's the first up to answer, and I mentioned the deer in the headlights moment as the candidate processes just how blank-minded each of these questions are. Young-Houlahan's response, that is a huge question. And then she gets into it, gives a feel-good speech, talks about how the D in Department of Defense stands for defense, that war should be a last resort. Putin is bad, Hamas is bad, North Korea is bad, yada yada. NATO needs to stand together. International economies need to work together to strengthen each other. Feel-good, neocon, neo-lib talking points. Neil Young responds, the Afghan withdrawal was a sign of weak leadership. Putin struck because Biden was weak. Neil Young himself says that he visited Afghanistan. At various points, talks about how sad it was that women's education has gone down. He says that opium was on the decline at the time the U.S. was there, and opium farming was being replaced by cash crops. But now that the Taliban is back, he says that opium farming is back. I need to do some more reading before I can confirm or deny that, because I've heard conflicting reports from different sources. But Neil Young's response centered a lot on Afghanistan. I gather that's a more personal issue for him. Next question is about background checks, mental health, and gun safety. Neil Young first up. People with mental health issues need background checks. He says that unfortunately, we're in a society where mass shootings happen, and so schools need more safety measures. They need armed guards. We need to enforce existing gun laws, and we need higher sentencing for some of these crimes. Young-Houlahan responds that we need more federal background checks. She responds that school guards create, quote, an atmosphere of oppression, unquote. She says, though, that mental health is not traditionally something that Republicans have cared a lot about, and that she's optimistic to see more Republicans talking about that, and she hopes to work across the aisle on that. Okay, fair enough. Next question, the candidates are asked about the Trump tax cuts, whether or not each candidate would renew them or let them lapse. Houlahan says once again that the SALT tax is bad, says that corporate tax needs to go up, but they need to balance, specifically line by line, what worked from that tax plan and what didn't. Neil Young says that tax cuts are good. Another quotable line from Neil Young, billionaires create millionaires, unquote. In other words, rich people increase the prosperity and economic output. Reminds me of Henry Ford's business model, raising the overall standard of living for the whole country. Now, next up is another sort of weird question. They asked the candidates would they take action to mitigate negative effects on small businesses if the tax cuts expire. Neil Young is the first to answer here, and I think this was a bad moment for him. He wasn't quite sure how he would feel if he hadn't had breakfast that morning. He says that he wouldn't let the tax cuts expire in the first place, but then he gets back on point. He says direct subsidy is a mistake, but by that point he had already used up a lot of his time. Houlahan once again cites her experience in Congress, and boy howdy, this next thing out of Houlahan's mouth. This sounds like something Trump would play on the big screen at one of his rallies when he illustrates how crazy Kamala is. Houlahan says that people have been figuring out how to make money in side hustles, and that's good and exciting. Let me tell you what I think of that. I donated plasma this year just as some extra padding in my budget because of inflation. So, Chrissy Houlahan, let them eat cake. Now, time for the closing arguments. Neil Young says, America is exceptional and we can make the world a better place. Quote, our government is only as good as the people who occupy the office, unquote. We need borders for safer communities and job creation. Free Americans, in other words, free from both inflation and from the impacts of mass migration, create prosperity. Quote, history shows us that a strong America always leads to a safer world, unquote. And then Chrissy Houlahan gives her closing. She is a veteran, she has experience growing the economy. Inflation and interest rates are going down. Wow, I totally believe that. She supports public schools and LGBT youth. She pretends that Neil Young was unclear on abortion. She regrets that a lot of topics such as LGBT youth were not addressed in this debate. I also regret that. She lists off some of the endorsements she's gotten, and then she claims to be bipartisan. Wonderful. So overall, I think the debate was a loss for both candidates. I don't think Neil Young had a good debate. However, silver lining is, I don't think many people at all even watched this debate. Now, how is this election likely to go? Well, any way you slice it, it is going to be an uphill battle for Neil Young, swinging 54,000 votes in a district that's a county and a half big. That is a lot to ask. However, I do think there is a possibility that this seat could flip red. First off, let me tell you what I've been seeing. I've been seeing for weeks now, the Neil Young campaign has a school bus that they painted white, and that is his Neil Young campaign bus. They've been driving it around the city, going to inner-city campaign events, yes, talking Spanish, to Hispanic voters like he did in his opening statement. I've been seeing Hispanic voters flipping. I'm less familiar with what Chester County looks like right now, but I did see on Scott Presler's Twitter that he talked to a team of Republicans from Puerto Rico who are flying up here from the island to door knock in the city of Reading to Spanish voters. I think that was over a week ago at this point, so those people would have been here for a little while already. Billboards on the highway, esta vez voto republicano, that's fun to see. Much more recent news, our neighboring county of Lancaster and their neighboring county of York County, each of them have stopped the processing of thousands of voter registrations, each of them have stopped this, that have identical handwriting, and in the press releases I heard tell of other counties they know of that have had the same thing. Those other counties have not made press releases about that yet. I do not know if Berks County is among them, or Chester for that matter, but I do know that Scott Presler's Early Vote Action people have been very active in Reading. I do know of them and other groups, by the way, that have been active in Chester County for Republican candidates. And to top it all off, here's the thing that actually does make me excited. Chrissy Houlahan has actually come out in public to campaign events in the city. This is something I have not been aware of happening in any of the past 3 elections she's been a candidate in, but it's happening now, and I'm detecting hints of Democrats being nervous about this election. Boy, oh boy, I really, really wish that I could see internal polling from either campaign. So what happens now? It's anyone's guess. I'll see you on Election Day.